Thank you very much, Michaela, and thank you, colleagues, for the invitation to speak at this really important conference. Thanks also to Bridget for a fantastic presentation. I think Social Work Without Borders is a wonderful organisation and a good example of the kind of radical social work that I want to talk about this morning. So thank you very much. Just in terms of the title, it's not the most cheerful title. As I was saying earlier, when I was a child growing up in the west of Scotland, there was a man who used to walk around wearing what's called a sandwich board or a placard, which said that the end of the world is near. I hope this morning I don't sound too much like that man. And in fact, I'm a great believer in the Antonio Gramsci's dictum of pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. And later in the talk, I will argue that there is a material basis for optimism, both through the limitations of neoliberal capitalism and also through the great social movements that we see from time to time, most recently Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. I think that it's in these movements and in that resistance that the hope lies, also for social work. But as my choice of Bob Dylan's lyrics in the title show, I do believe clearly that the situation in which we, by which I mean humanity, as the custodians of life on Earth, is clearly very serious. So just to start with, hopefully this will work, start with the PowerPoint, I'll take it from here. So let me just try this. Can everybody see that?
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so now let me just see. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I want to begin by looking at three of the most pressing threats that face us. First of all, there's what we can call the biological crisis. And very briefly, I think there are two dimensions to that crisis. First of all, there is climate change. Fossil fuel capitalism has resulted in the mass extinction of species on a scale that we've not seen for roughly 66 million years. It's led to the pollution of rivers and lakes and of the planet. And as a recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has shown, has raised global temperatures in a way which threatens to make life on Earth impossible for millions of people in decades, if not years. And then the second dimension of the biological crisis, as we all know only too well, is the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a catastrophe which has so far claimed the lives of 4 million people and left hundreds of thousands with long COVID, with mental health problems and so on. And there's a number of radical biologists like Rob Wallace and Mike Davis have shown this is very far from being a natural disaster. Rather, it's a product of neoliberal capitalism's relentless drive for profit, with factory farming methods and the destruction of natural habitats, making the spread of viruses much more likely. So that's the first of the existential threats that we face. Secondly, there's economic crisis, because the truth is that the global economy has never fully recovered from the great crash of 2008. And the cost of bailing out the banks and bailing out and saving capitalism since that time has been paid for by millions of ordinary people across Europe in the form of austerity policies and cuts to living standards and to services. At the beginning of this pandemic, a phrase we heard very often was, "We can't go back to the way things were before." But the reality is that unless we see much greater resistance than we've seen so far, then once again, it will be the ordinary people, the working class people of the world who will pay the costs of this current crisis through unemployment, attacks on living standards, and the destruction of welfare. And finally, there's the crisis I want to refer to as the political crisis, because the adoption by formerly social democratic parties like the Labour Party in Britain of neoliberal policies over the past 20 years has led to a collapse in working class support for these parties and the growth, as we only know too well, of the far right and of neo-fascist parties across the globe, from Brazil to India, from France to USA, and of course Austria. And you don't need me to tell you this, Austria has been very, very far from being immune from the rise of racism and neo-fascism. So that briefly is the context for our discussions today. So the stakes, I think, are very high indeed. And the question that I really want to address today, I think in many ways a very simple one, but a very complicated one, which is, where is social work in all of this? What contribution, if any, can social work as a value-based profession play in challenging the forces of racism and reaction, and in promoting an agenda which foregrounds human rights, the environment, and anti-racism? And maybe to state the obvious, any role that social work can play will clearly be a limited one. Addressing the kind of existential threats that I've mentioned will require much more powerful social forces, including great social movements and class-based movements of the sort we saw during the upheavals, the great social movements of the 1960s, and more recently during the Arab Spring. But having said that, nevertheless, it is the case that social workers in the past have often had a much wider view of their role than many have today. And now my slides seem to have stuck. Hang on. Let me try.
For us, it worked.
I've got it. It's okay. Got it. So this quote is from a social worker called Lillian Wald, who is a leading figure in the young American social work movement. And she wrote in 1914, she wrote, social work, sorry, it's the next slide. Let me just move it on. Move it back, hang on. In its broadest conception, social work is teaching the sanctity of human life and the doctrine of the brotherhood of man. Forgive the gendered language. The social workers of our time are dreaming a great dream and seeing a great vision of democracy, of a real brotherhood among men. War is the doom of all that has taken years to build up. And the social workers of that period were often very active anti-war advocates. So a much broader vision of social work than people often have today. So how should we see the social work role in respect of some of the kind of challenges that I've outlined above? And maybe the first thing to say is that there is no guarantee as to how the social work profession will respond to these public issues, these wider troubles. The British academic Bill Jordan has argued, social work has played various roles in contrasting systems of social provision and has served a number of political ends. Its great virtue, that it is almost infinitely adaptable to circumstances, also makes it open to exploitation for any kind of policy objectives. So what I want to do in the first part of this paper today is to look at some of the ways in which social workers have responded to major political challenges in the past, to see what we can learn from our own history. And to a large extent, these different responses have been shaped by the dominant political traditions within social work. Because as the US academic James Midgley has identified, and as Malcolm Payne has also argued, social work international social work has always been a contested profession with three main different traditions. Remedial social work, if you like, one-to-one casework. There is developmental social work, which has played a major role, I think, especially in the global south. And there is activist or radical social work. And it's this third tradition, as you might expect, that I mainly want to focus on today. not because it has ever been the dominant tradition. The reality is that radical social work has always been a minority tradition within social work. Not because there are no strengths. Not because there are no strengths in the other traditions, I think there are, but I want to focus on radical social work for two main reasons. First of all, because unlike the other two traditions, the radical social work explicitly sees social work as a political activity which needs to engage with the political activities of the day. We cannot pretend, and perhaps we can discuss this more in discussion, we cannot pretend to be non-political. That's the first point. But secondly, and this comes back to the optimistic or the cheerful part of my talk that Michaela referred to, I believe, and Bridget's presentation is a good example of it, I believe we are currently seeing a revival, a renewal of interest in the radical social work tradition, what I have called elsewhere the new social work radicalism. And in the second part of my talk, I want to look at some current examples of that. But before then, let's look at some examples of how social work, the profession, has responded to major political challenges in the past. And I want to suggest that there have been three main responses. The first is collusion, often with oppression. The second is compliance, going along with oppression or oppressive regimes or practices. And the third is contestation, challenging or resisting oppression. So to begin with the first one, one response has been active collusion and cooperation with oppressive state practices. There is a dominant narrative within much of the mainstream social work literature, which sees social work as primarily a benign profession, a kind and helping profession based on Kantian ethics and solely concerned with helping people. And it probably is the case, certainly in my experience, that the vast majority of people who come into social work do so with good intentions. But unfortunately, as we've argued in our book, Global Social Work in a Political Context, social work has its own share of horrible histories. And here I want to refer briefly to three of these. So social work in Nazi Germany, social work in Greece under dictatorship, and then social work in the UK with the UK child migrant scheme. So let's begin by looking at social work in Nazi Germany, which is perhaps the lowest point in the profession's history. People like Walter Lorenz and Tim Kunstreich and others have documented the ways in which the diagnostic skills of social workers were often used within the Nazi regime, within their eugenicist social programs, to sort out the deserving from the unworthy, those with mental health problems or learning disabilities, who would then be deemed eligible for compulsory sterilization or extermination. And Lorenz has written, sticking to their professional task with the air of value neutrality and scientific detachment, especially after the non-conforming politically active social workers have been sacked or imprisoned, social workers did not feel responsible for the consequences of their assessments and may indeed not have been conscious of the full implications their work had. So it's estimated that around 70,000 mentally ill and learning disabled individuals were systematically exterminated in Germany between 1939 and 1941, a figure that had risen to 200,000 by the end of the Second World War. And sadly, the social work profession was implicated in these horrors. My second example comes from Greece, where research by my colleague and co-author Vasilis Yakimedes has shone a light on the role played by the leadership of the Greek social work profession during decades of political tension and the suppression of civil rights during the 7-year military junta. As Vasilis has shown, much of the resistance against the dictatorship came from young people, mostly school students and university students. But when the military found it too difficult to control unruly young people, and many teachers were too politicized to deal with the issue, the Greek Association of Social Workers contacted the dictatorship, offering the full support of the social workers in controlling these young people. And in response, the dictatorship's Ministry of Welfare circulated a memo which was entitled Arrangements for Social Workers in the Professional Use, which suggested that the Greek government, during the general ongoing reforms, will look after all the remaining social work demands. We really appreciate social workers' contribution to the constructive implementation of our social programs. The Ministry of Social Services will take all the appropriate measures for the advantageous and coherent celebration of social workers in commission. And the Greek Association of Social Workers celebrated that collaboration and reassured the generals that Greek social workers were well equipped to deal with issues of social adjustment, and stressing that social workers are better qualified than teachers in preventing social problems in schools. And remember, this was a regime actively involved in using all means, including torture, to suppress pro-democracy activists. Example number 3 comes from my own country, from the UK, and concerns the UK child migrant scheme. Between the end of the 19th century and the early 1970s, around 150,000 children, 150,000 children who were in care and who came from very poor backgrounds, were sent from Britain to Australia, Canada and other British colonies in a scheme that was supported by some of the leading social work children's charities in the UK, including Barnardo's and Quarriers. They were sent to replenish the workforce in countries like Australia and Canada with what was described as good white stock. So during that period, 150,000 children were being sent. Many were used as child labour. Others were abused physically, emotionally and sexually in foster homes, state-run orphanages and religious institutions. The children were told, often falsely, that their parents were dead, while their parents were given little information about where their offspring were going. And survivors have said that on arrival, they were often separated from brothers and sisters and subjected to the brutal physical and sexual abuse. So in 2010, the Prime Ministers of Britain and Australia publicly apologised to the survivors for the abuse that they had suffered. It's one of the most shameful episodes in the history of social work. So that is perhaps some of the worst examples of the collusion of the social work profession with oppression and exploitation. The second example that I want to look at, the second response that I want to look at, is what can be called compliance. And this is a much more common response, I think, which is to somehow portray social work as a politically neutral profession. We don't get involved in these political dilemmas. We are a profession which somehow stands above politics. And that, as an example of that view, is the statement by the UK Health Minister launching the new social work degree in 2002, where she said social work is a very practical job. It's not about being able to give fluent and theoretical explanations of why people get into difficulties in the first place. So let's think about the bigger issues. But that narrow, depoliticized view of social work, which of course is also a defining feature of what I'll call neoliberal social work, which we'll talk about later, is one which has been promoted by governments in the UK, both Labour and Conservative, for more than 2 decades. And in fact, that denial of the political nature of social work has not meant that social work has remained ethically pure. Quite the opposite. In my view, in practice, it has often meant social workers remaining silent when they should have spoken out, of social workers failing to challenge policies and practices which oppress our clients and which contribute to oppression and inequality, and pursuing instead a very narrow technical focus on social work methods and technologies overall in the pursuit of professional respectability. But if the response of one group of social workers has been collusion, and of a second group has been to remain silent and just get on with the job, it's also true historically there has been a third response. It's a response of active resistance to oppression. It's a response of social workers taking sides. It's a response which is often associated with the radical social work movement, which developed in Canada, the US, Australia, and elsewhere during the 70s. A movement that was very much fueled by the great social movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the gay movement, etc., of the 60s. Just briefly to touch on that movement, some of its key features was an emphasis on structural inequality, not individual failings. In other words, the problem is not inadequate clients. It involved a critique of the welfare state as often being oppressive and controlling. It argued for a different relationship between workers and clients, a much more equal relationship. It had an emphasis on collective approaches, including community work. It argued for alliances between social work organisations and collectives of service users. It argued that social workers were not somehow above society, but were also workers and needed to be in trade unions. But the essence of it, I think, is a statement by Roy Bailey and Mike Brake that radical social work is essentially understanding the position of the oppressed in the context of the social and economic structures they live in. So that movement, I think, was certainly a very important development in the history of social work. But I think sometimes it's assumed that it was only a British movement, that's when radical social work began. And I want to argue that in reality, the radical social work tradition is both much older and also much more global than that 1970s movement. So, for example, in a speech in 1910, Jane Addams, one of the founders of American social work, argued, one group who have traditionally been moved to action by pity for the poor, we call charitable. The other, larger or smaller in each generation, but always fired by the hatred of injustice, we designate as the radicals. This was in 1910. And in fact, the US, American social work today is often seen as very narrow and very clinical, but actually in the US, in the period up to the First World War and beyond, social workers in the US were seen as the main social reformers. Nor has it only been confined to the US and to the West. On the contrary, as we have also argued, and this is a very important point, I think, that one of the best examples and one of the longest examples of radical praxis, and one of the least known here, is the reconceptualization movement, which developed in the Latin America during the 1960s and 1970s. It's a movement that was based on the ideas of Paulo Freire and Camilo Torres, and on the social movements that were emerging in Latin America at that time. It was a movement that sought to develop a social work theory and practice, which both challenged the oppressive structures of capitalism and contributed to the struggle for a different kind of society. So radical social work then, I would argue, is not a new tradition, but I think, as Bridget mentioned, it's a tradition that's been in retreat really since the beginning of the 1980s, and during what we might call the long night of neoliberalism. But in the final part of my talk, I want to argue that this is starting to change, and that we're now seeing examples of what I've called elsewhere the new social work radicalism. I think a number of different factors have contributed to the new radicalism. I think the first is the return of capitalist crisis, the collapse of the global economy in 2008. The period since then has seen cuts to services, austerity, and also the demonization of service users, including people with disabilities or people claiming welfare benefits, the people whom social workers work with on a day-to-day basis. I think a second factor has been the influence of social movements, going right back to the growth of the anti-capitalist movement, the social justice movement after Seattle, through the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then more recently anti-racist movements such as Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, and so on and so forth. I think they've been very, very important. But I think if there is one single factor that has driven the new social work radicalism, it is an increasing dissatisfaction with what social work has become, with the impact of new public management, of managerialism, of the creation of a social work business driven by market priorities and not by values or need. Something that has led to the growth of what we have called neoliberal social work. So I think that has been a factor which has led many workers to claim, in the title of a meeting we held in Glasgow in 2004, I didn't come into social work for this. And we saw that, I think we saw the influence of that model in even during the COVID crisis. During that crisis, we in the Social Work Action Network organised with the International Federation of Social Workers a series of seminars, global seminars, looking at the response of social work to the COVID pandemic. We published this has been published as a book called Social Work and the COVID-19 Pandemic. On the positive side, from countries like Greece, from Chile, from South Africa, we saw examples of new and very imaginative ways that social workers had developed to keep in touch with service users during the crisis, to reduce social isolation and to protect mental health. And there were also some very good accounts of social workers making links with the new community-based organisation, Mutual Aid, the organisation that was springing up everywhere. But we also heard another less positive side to the picture, because many social workers reported that in their agencies, it was, in their words, business as usual. That rather than responding in new and creative ways to this wholly unprecedented situation, there was still the same management preoccupation with procedures, with meeting budgets, with meeting targets, the same emphasis on monitoring, surveillance and risk, rather than on working with service users to help them collectively address their needs and their difficulties. Other social workers talk about social work being invisible during the crisis. I want to stress that that situation is not the fault of individual workers or even the fault of individual managers. Rather, I think, as I've suggested, it reflects the dominance of a market-driven ideology which emerged in the 1990s and which is often called managerialism or new public management. Excuse me. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I suspect you're very familiar with it, although it's probably more evident in the UK than some other places. But essentially, it's shaped by a managerial approach, by the domination of budgets. It's an approach which sees service users primarily as customers or consumers. Its dominant feature is individualism and the rejection of collective responses, sees social work as a technical occupation rather than an ethical profession. It involves a depoliticization of social work, and it's resulted in increased bureaucracy and the domination of technology. And that model, neoliberal social work, I think is a million miles away from what many of us would recognize as good social work practice. And it's meant that during the COVID crisis, in my view, social work has played much less of a role than it could have done. But to conclude, or to move towards my conclusion, I think it doesn't have to be that way. I think we have already heard this morning about one excellent example of social work radicalism in the form of the work being done by Social Work Without Borders. So to conclude, I want to give some other examples of the ways in which social workers around the globe of practices that have emerged over the past decade and that are seeking to renew the social work radical tradition. The first of these, which you may have heard of, emerged in Spain in 2014, and this was called the Orange Tide. It was a very important movement of social workers and service users, which combined workers and people who use services. Across Spain, they regularly gathered in orange t-shirts on the streets with music and dance to portray the message of no cuts to social services. Spanish newspapers and television widely reported the social action. The Orange Tide became part of mainstream media and was driven by social workers. A second example, and this does involve people taking to the streets and demonstrations, but this is social workers in Hong Kong, a fantastic group of frontline workers who have been very involved in the social movements in recent years and who I think have played a very important role in developing more radical forms of practice. They have developed an organization called the Progressive Social Work Network. They have been involved in the Occupy Hong Kong movement in 2011, in the Umbrella Democracy movement of 2014 and 15, and they've been involved in the more recent struggles for democratic rights, including involvement in strike action for democratic rights and for rights for clients. In 2010, they organised a very well organised progressive social work conference, and in 2019, they have now linked up with social workers in mainland China, in Taiwan, and in Japan, and organised in 2019, the third annual progressive social work conference in Kyoto in Japan. A fantastic group of young social workers. The third example I'll mention is from the US, and often, as I've said, we see American social work can be very clinical, but I think what's incredibly encouraging is a development in recent years to the inequality and the scapegoating of the poor that's characterized in neoliberalism. We've seen a revival of radical social work theory and practice in the USA. One of the best examples, I think, is the Boston Health Liberation Group, who, in addition to campaigning activity, have developed this model of practice and documented its use across a range of social work settings. And briefly, it's a model of practice which is holistic, locates individuals in their context, it's critical, it challenges neoliberalism, it's very empowering. It's similar to what Bridget was saying about the direct work done by Social Work Without Borders. The practice or the practice with clients is very empowering and challenging the stigmatization that many of them experience, and it's essentially hopeful. It's about looking at previous progressive practices and is very much focused on people's capacity for change. And the final example I'll look at is one that I personally have been most involved in. It's the Social Work Action Network in the UK. This was a network that was founded in 2006, a conference attended by 300 practitioners in the UK. And its activity since 2006 has taken 4 main forums. First of all, very well attended annual conferences, which have involved workers, have involved service users, academics and campaigners, and have addressed a range of issues from the refugees, asylum seekers, austerity, privatization and racism. And I said a key feature of these conferences is the involvement of service users, both as delegates and as platform speakers. Secondly, we have been involved in a wide range of campaigns including campaigns around asylum seekers. I was privileged to be part of a SWAN delegation to Calais in 2016. I haven't been as often as Bridget, but it was fantastic to be there and to meet up with social work and to meet up with asylum seekers there. But we've also been involved in campaigning against the privatization of children's services and also challenging cuts to mental health services. And most recently, we have been campaigning for a publicly owned social care system based not on profit but on need. Thirdly, in terms of developing radical theory for radical practice, in 2013 we launched the journal Critical and Radical Social Work, which has now established a very, very wide global readership with something like 80 universities subscribing to it and developing a radical theory for radical practice. But finally, and this very much ties in with the theme of today's conference, I think one of the most exciting developments has been the launch in 2020 of SWAN International. And SWAN International involves regular meetings of representatives of radical social work groups from across the globe. So at our most recent meeting, we had delegates from more than 14 countries, including Brazil, Chile, Argentina, the US, Greece, Sweden, Hong Kong, South Africa, and many more. And at these meetings, we have discussed campaigns to support those fleeing the West's wars in Afghanistan, building solidarity with LGBT communities under attack in Hungary, building solidarity with people in Palestine, and so on and so forth. So really, these are just a few of the examples. And I should say finally, in terms of what I began with, our current discussions are how we can build social work solidarity with the demonstrations around the COP26 environmental conference in Glasgow later on this year. We want to see a big radical social work presence at the demonstrations there. So these are just a few of the examples, I think, of the kind of initiatives that are developing and have developed and are developing. And I think what they emphasize that radical social work is not just part of social work's history, but is a living set of ideas and of practices, and that another social work is both necessary and possible. So to conclude, I'll just finish with what is perhaps, I think, the core value of radical social work. It's a value that is often not mentioned in lists of social work texts and standard textbooks, but I think is probably the central social work value, and that is the value of solidarity. Solidarity with the oppressed. So I'll just finish briefly with some lines by the great Uruguayan poet and writer Eduardo Galeano, who wrote, "I don't believe in charity. I believe in solidarity. Charity is so vertical, it goes from top to the bottom. Solidarity is horizontal. It respects the other person. I have a lot to learn from other people." And I'll finish there. Thank you.